Alrighty guys, so welcome to our lecture on the international style, and this is really where modernism all comes together. In the 50s and 60s, during this post-World War II reconstruction era. This is the most prominent style of modern architecture still today. Some might say we are still in the age of international architecture, even though the next two lectures we're going to talk about, in some sense, have replaced it. The majority of buildings you're going to see in a modern city belong to this international style, and we're still building in it today. And so in this lecture, I'm going to show you a lot of works, because this style is kind of hard to recognize unless you see a lot of examples. So without further ado, let's get into some background. So the actual name international style came from two American art historians, Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, who in 1932, you'll remember, mounted this exhibition on modern architects held in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This was the exhibition, if you'll remember, that sidelined Frank Lloyd Wright as a has-been. And so among the important buildings symbolizing the international style was the Narkofim housing project in Moscow, which we've seen, the Bauhaus School, which we've seen, various houses by Mies van der Rohe, and the Villa Savoy in France by Le Corbusier, which we've seen. And so the exhibition coined this term, international style, because they recognized very similar modern styles simultaneously develop in different countries, right? So you see Russian constructivism in Russia, you see the work of Le Corbusier in France, you see neoplasticism in Germany promoted by the Bauhaus. And so they thought this would soon become an international style because it was so functional and removed from culture, right? It could appear in any culture. It was about human happiness and human health. It wasn't about cultural values. But it's also kind of taken on a second meaning today. International style. This is a style you find internationally. This is a style you find in every major city around the world. It very successfully spread around the world as predicted by these curators. So this is really why, the name still makes sense today. It is the pan-human architectural style. It's the international style, which you find absolutely everywhere. So the European cities devastated during the bombings of World War II led to these widely needed acts of town planning, as you can imagine. So these large housing settlements and new towns were built all over Europe. And as you can imagine, Le Corbusier's Domino concrete panel building and the glass and steel blocks of the Bauhaus offered these cheap, expedient solutions. And so I hope you understand that Reconstruction architects wanted to avoid the sort of monumentality and classicism of fascist Italy and Germany used during the war. Very disenchanted with these styles, associating them with very brutal fascism. And so for both practical and ideological reasons, they really strongly liked the simple, undecorated solutions of functionalism. And a lot of architects caught on with this start from scratch approach. Build a new future, a new pan-human feature. And so the international style, which before belonged to these avant-garde kind of sideline projects for flat-roofed white boxes with pure planes and long windows, became the accepted solution for reconstruction. And although not very popular before World War I, the international style united the needs of Reconstruction Europe. So before we get to Europe, it's been a while since we've talked about America, so let's start with America. So as you know, the US emerged relatively unscathed from World War II, being all the way across the world from Europe. And so because they were unscathed and Europe had to rebuild, they surged ahead to build the world's most dominant economy, inspired by Europe's reconstructive city planning projects. And this was absolutely the perfect time because many European modernist architects, especially those influenced by Le Corbusier, Russian constructivism, and neoplasticism, actually immigrated to America at the start of the war to avoid either the draft or Nazi Germany and made their practices in the States. And so as a result, this attracted the attention of new American business titans after World War II, looking to showcase their company's wealth and prestige and to show the forward-thinking nature of their companies, the modern nature of their companies. Walter Gropius and many of his Bauhaus students fled to America before the war. Mies van der Rohe did too, and many architects in his circle. Many of these were these left-wing German architects targeted by the Nazis, kind of forced to leave. And so, very much inspired by the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, city councils in America carried out these sizable plans to demolish city centers in the name of urban renewal. So let's talk about this first building you see here. So as many of you know, the United Nations was founded in 1945, right at the end of the war, as this, peacekeeping organization from preventing another world war. And Le Corbusier was actually hired as one of 10 members on the international design team to design this building under the grand supervision of Wallace Harris, who was in charge of the entire building. But despite the idea of teamwork, Le Corbusier actually kind of dominated the process, and the final design kind of synthesized his scheme. So this is really his building. You can tell already, this was the result of a rectangular domino plan tower connected to this low-slung auditorium, offering a very clear contrast to the hemmed-in density of Manhattan. And obviously you remember from the domino plan, the supports are on the inside in the form of columns, in the form of pilotis. So the entire outside was able to be this kind of sheet glass, and this kind of, glazed slab of the rectangular tower became an instant icon of modern technology. But you have to imagine a New York with none of these types of buildings. This was really the first truly modernist skyscraper in New York. And so, an entirely glass building generated a lot of suspicion, especially concerns about structural integrity and cooling. Obviously the structural integrity is sound. The building is still standing today, but they did and do still have a major problem with cooling in this building because the architects used green tinted thermophile glass, which required the inside to receive copious amounts of air conditioning. This is one of the drawbacks of these early international style skyscrapers. They were very, very expensive to maintain a cool temperature year round on the inside. Meanwhile, the Golden Triangle project in Pittsburgh served as this prototype for American urban renewal. So the planners essentially attempted to replace this decaying industrial slum in the city center with these aluminum-clad cruciform high-rises designed by New York architect Irving Clavin. And you'll notice these towers seemed like replicas of Le Corbusier's Radiant City. Clavin was very much inspired by Le Corbusier's theories of urban renewal. And so urban renewal in America imposed these clean slate demolitions, flattening city centers and low-income neighborhoods to prepare the way for either modernist corporate headquarters or traffic interchanges. And so from around 1950 to around 1966, it was really popular for entire sections of American downtowns to be bulldozed, very sadly, usually at the expense of poor and ethnic neighborhoods, resulting in these new business and government enclaves. And this is why in a lot of American cities, you see a kind of historic downtown and then a business district uptown, very much in the international modernist style. These used to be more often than not the poor or ethnic neighborhoods. And so the US, which had only really suffered war damage in Hawaii, experienced the equivalent of the bombed out sites of European reconstruction, with the difference being Americans got to choose where they wanted their international style enclaves. So they usually centered around kind of this focused point in American cities, whereas in European cities, they're all over the place depending on where the city got bombed. So this resulted in, among other cities, the famous Albany's Empire State Plaza. It was designed by this American modernist Wallace Harrison to provide Governor Nelson Rockefeller with this business district kind of improvised from the UN project, inspired from the UN project. And it actually required, very sadly, the displacement of 9,000 poor Jewish and Italian residents. But it was essentially this kind of marble-clad terrace lined with these slender business towers in an egg-shaped auditorium for the city. And so, as you might be getting to see, while urban renewal promised to revive city centers, it actually, in many cases, had the reverse effect, creating these kind of cloistered office environments occupied only during business hours. And so, as you can imagine, this absolutely stripped any sense of community that might have been there beforehand in the name of capitalism, in the name of extracting greater rents from this area, because businesses are stacked on businesses, and they're paying the developer 100, 200 times more rent than they had been getting from, in this case, the 9,000 poor Jewish and Italian residents. And in turn, the subsidized housing projects that cities offered to these displaced residents were known for their catastrophes. A great example is the Pruitt Eagle project built near downtown St. Louis with its 33 brick high-rises. And these buildings were never really properly finished, and they became a sort of haven for crime. There was a total lack of funding, a lack of maintenance, and a lack of transportation. And so 20 years later, public officials actually decided to demolish it, as well as a number of other sites like this, inspiring kind of a massive widespread distrust of modern planning in the US. Mies van der Rohe, though, more than really any modernist immigrant working in the US, set the professional standard for the international style after World War II. So Mies actually left Berlin for Chicago in 1938 to head to the School of Architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And like many pre-war modernists, his work had been confined to small private villas, but once in the US, he received commissions for over 100 large-scale public buildings. So essentially here, Mies planned the new campus of IIT, and over a decade he kind of developed it into this disciplined landscape of minimalist urban order. So Mies essentially prepared this arrangement of low, flat boxes, establishing this language of, large glass planes and flat frames set in green spaces as the new face of the university. And finally, Mies added what's called Crown Hall as his final contribution to the IIT campus, and it was designed for none other than the architecture school. And it presented, this single columnless hall as an essay in, as he said, universal space. But essentially, it suspended the entire roof and curtain walls from an exoskeletal system of these 13 feet deep steel trusses attached on either end of steel columns. So inside, there were absolutely no columns. There were absolutely no partitions of space. There was no structure needed but the exoskeleton to hold up this building. And not since flying buttresses appeared in the medieval period had such an ingenious method been invented for using external structure to liberate interior space from structural mass. But on the downside, the completely exposed interior presented, a constant challenge of how to adapt specific functions to a kind of universalist space. People don't know how to organize space when there are no pre-dividing walls. So, more often than not, this building is still used as an art museum for very large-scale art installations. Mies's projects after this kind of looked like siblings of the IIT campus building. So here at the Lakeshore Drive Apartments, built in 1948, he set two 26-story rectangular boxes perpendicular to each other and dressing them with the same kind of I-beam mullions on fully glazed elevations seen at the university. And you notice here, he's taking a page out of Le Corbusier by building both buildings on these kind of slender pilotis that go all the way up and support each of the floors. But this essentially, again, frees up the ground space to the pedestrians so they don't have to navigate around the buildings. They can navigate through the buildings on the ground floor. And later on, Mies actually enlisted one of his old Bauhaus colleagues to help him design another project, Lafayette Park, in 1956, this superblock of mixed-scale housing in Detroit. And essentially, they arranged sets of single-story courtyard houses, long rows of two-story apartments, and 3 isolated apartment towers in what's called a traffic-free park. You know, this park where parking lots, where roads are kind of positioned away from the park. You know, it's this very peaceful, tranquil housing unit, subsidized housing unit in the middle of a massive park. So it is a very healthy, happy place to live. You know, this project was also racially and economically mixed. It's one of the few successful subsidized housing projects in the United States. So Mies van der Rohe also built quite a few private houses in America. Here's really his most famous house, the Farnsworth House, commissioned from Dr. Edith Farnsworth as this kind of small country retreat. And here, you know, Mies van der Rohe could really show his skill building something truly artistic, truly cutting edge in the scene of American architecture. So the Farnsworth House is essentially this long, oblong glass room of a house raised 5 feet off the ground on these 8 exoskeletal I-beam columns. So essentially, to enter this house, you ascend to the covered porch, which kind of occupied one of 3 bays, through a floating glass door, and are met with this single room glass house. And you'll notice the interior is only divided by this long rosewood paneled island, but it only contains a fireplace and 2 bathrooms for a bit of privacy. Otherwise, the kitchen is tucked into the linear counter running the length of the island, and the bed abutted the short side of the island. And you'll notice this is essentially built in the Domino plan, inspired from Le Corbusier, right? But it doesn't have reinforced concrete. It's structurally held up instead by I-beam mullions, the signature medium of Mies van der Rohe. This was, though, in the end, much more out there than Dr. Farnsworth asked for. And you know, her difficulty adjusting to the house actually led to a bitter lawsuit against Mies van der Rohe for cost overruns, difficulties of heating and cooling, lack of storage, and lack of privacy inside and out. You know, even though you can shut the curtains, you really still don't feel private. Imagine if your house was entirely glass with only curtains between you and the outside world. In the end, though, she actually lost the case, and after, attempting to cope with what she called her misconception house, pun intended, she ended up moving to Italy, where she lived very happily in seclusion. Despite the defects, though, the Farnsworth house inspired imitation. Some thought these were very fashionable. The most famous is Philip Johnson's glass house, built in 1949. But even still, these were used as weekend houses or party houses, not really permanent residences. So overlooking this particular glass house, he actually added a guest house built in solid brick that he actually ended up sleeping in when he was living here. It was just as private as the glass house was exposed. So he ended up kind of just using the glass house as a leisure center and a party center on weekends. And the two actually worked together in this next project. So Johnson actually assisted Mies van der Rohe in his New York Seagram Building for the world's largest liquor company, built in 1956. The extremely wealthy Seagram Beverages Company, I'm sure you've heard of them, had originally made their fortune being based in Canada during the Prohibition in America, so selling to Americans across the border, selling to Canadians. And, here they finally wanted to establish their headquarters in New York, and they wanted to hire the most famous architect in the world to build their office building in order to make their building a sort of architectural attraction, in order to paint them as a very modern, future-thinking company. So it's a really interesting story on how they decided which architect to go with. So the heads of the company actually headed over to the Museum of Modern Art in New York and spoke to the curator of architecture. And they were told that they had 3 choices. They could go with Le Corbusier, but they were told he was kind of too difficult to work with. They were told they could go with Frank Lloyd Wright, but they were told he was too old. He was almost 90. So the curators actually suggested they go with Mies van der Rohe, the up-and-coming German master of the international style in America. You know, Mies had been designing buildings of this kind since the 1920s, but he never had the chance to build an office building. And Mies didn't disappoint. He designed for them the first true curtain wall building in New York, which meant glass went all the way around as an unbroken facade. And this was also one of the most expensive buildings of its time. The Seagram company really wanted to show off, but they also wanted to stay modern to show a forward-thinking image. So instead of extraneous ornament, they used burnished bronze I-beams. And the welded I-beams on the surface really serve no purpose but decoration. They simply give the surface some depth and play of shadow. They actually still have to rub these I-beams with oil twice a year so that they do not oxidize. Adding to the expenses, the elevator banks were actually lined in Roman travertine, this kind of limestone that only forms naturally around hot springs, a very rare material. And believe it or not, Mies actually really loved ancient Greek architecture over all things, so he kind of designed the building to reflect an ancient Greek monument, to be, very symmetrical. And, if you admire the steel pillars which run across the front, and Mies set back the building to create a large public space for doing this, they remind you of the fluted columns that line Greek and Roman temples. It's almost as if we're looking at a modern Parthenon or Pantheon. But the lobby is also really set back to give the ground back to the pedestrians, a signature of the international style invented by Le Corbusier. Mies's final work was the new National Gallery in Berlin, built from 1962 to 1968, and it replaced the old neoclassical National Gallery in Berlin with something so incredibly modern just 80 years later. The neoclassical architects would have been amazed with the internationalists' embrace of industry and using it to distill the lessons of the ancients in buildings that are just made of metal and glass. The cruciform columns here stood like colossal intersected I-beams and tapered from bottom to top, reminiscent of the Pantheon. It featured a massive roof plane of steel coffers over just 8 crossbeam columns. In only 9 hours, he lifted the prefabricated roof into place and hinged the 8 columns to it. But just like his buildings on the IIT campus, the void of the interior posed these great problems for museum display. So today, this great hall has become a prime location for site-specific installation art, while more traditional exhibitions are actually held in the basement, more easily quadrant up. Mies often used the expression almost nothing to describe the challenge of perfect design. Buildings, according to him, should be almost nothing. So let's shift back to Europe. Many cities, as I said, were wholly or partially destroyed during the aerial bombardment of World War II, and we already saw one man's attempt at reconstruction with Le Corbusier, and most international style architects, if you haven't caught on, were inspired massively by his Domino house. So Rotterdam in the Netherlands was actually the first to respond with a reconstruction plan. So civic leaders and architects of the city actually proposed to wipe out old property lines and rebuild the city center to a 35% building to space ratio. And so their new plan kept an even mix of uses in the city center. They had apartments, shops, and offices, while eliminating factories to the outskirts, something long overdue since the Industrial Revolution. And the principal avenues of the downtown were 3 times wider than the main old street. They, as well as many similarly bombed city centers of Europe, developed a central 4-block long concourse and shopping street in the center of downtown, devoted entirely to pedestrians, lined with shops, trees, benches, and pergolas. So this new shopping street, completed in 1953, provided a much admired model for creating a pedestrian haven in a city of cars, and this is something we really still don't have in the United States that many, in fact the majority of European cities have today. And this was massively successful in the Netherlands and really all across Europe. This brought the city to life again, and many Dutch cities, after they got these new rebuilt city centers with pedestrian devoted shopping streets, expanded outward very rapidly with spacious housing estates. They could finally spread out in what was previously a very clustered European city. These post-war reconstruction pedestrian centers really brought back the idea of the medieval community square before the rise of the automobile made them kind of trafficked and obsolete. A great attempt of the Le Corbusier Tower in the Park scheme is the construction of Bijlmermeer in 1961, this kind of southern district of Amsterdam designed by architect Siegfried Nasseth. It's 40,000 units, made up essentially the largest housing estate in Europe. So these 9-story bar buildings followed a honeycomb grid, and pedestrians were supposed to filter through hexagonal courts to parklands, playgrounds, and lakes inspired after Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin. But it suffered from lack of services, like so many other tower in the park centers like we saw in America. It had very poor transportation, very little maintenance, and racial discrimination. But the biggest flaw was the car garages were along the highway, forcing the residents to walk more than 500 meters to their apartments. And so instead of being accessed from streets and plazas, the units were entered from long corridors and park paths, which became frequent sites for crimes and muggings. As you might guess, many were torn down in the 1900s and replaced with low-rise alternatives with parkings close by. It was a good try. But let's look at how some other European countries handled their post-war reconstruction. Post-war Britain enacted the New Towns Act of 1946 for reconstruction, and with this they built 28 new towns for a population of 2.2 million during 1947 to 1951, and again in 1961 to 1970. And in post-war London, they adopted the high-rise models of Le Corbusier, such as at the Churchill Gardens estate in a bombed-out acreage along the Thames. It's almost, Russian constructivist looking, but I hope you can see the similarities with Le Corbusier's Unité de Habitation. The Barbican Centre, though, appeared the most heroic of British reconstruction programs. So, it was a 40-acre site in smack dab central London and became essentially a megastructure raised over a parking plinth set off from the streets. Its 13 towers held 2,000 units connected to a grand internal landscape laced with kind of Mughal-style floating water gardens. And the enclave contained 3 theaters, a concert hall, cinemas, schools, and convention centers. You essentially never had to leave. But its interior circulation ended up being so complex that lines had to be actually taped to the pavement to help people find their way. And, public opinion is still very divided about this place. France, on the other hand, produced the best variety of formal solutions for post-war public housing, from, straightforward functionalist bars to more expressive artistic experiments. So, the stark anonymity of large slab projects led many French architects toward seeking ways of stacking prefab units to leave interstitial social space and rooftop gardens. John Ridout created the most expressive of these, and his most famous is the 1969 star-shaped project at Ivry you see here. While the French government kind of snubbed Le Corbusier for his brutalist style, his theories of tower in the park, urbanism, and mass-produced housing absolutely dominated post-war planning procedures. He did, however, achieve a significant commission in rebuilding the bombed-out sector of the industrial town of Firminy, which we talked about, which, as I said, included a stadium, a cultural center, a church, and another unité housing block. So throughout the 1950s and 1960s, it seemed that the international style would never run out of enthusiasm, until it did. Over time, the idealism of modernism became less associated with building a better world and more associated with corporate identity, as I'm sure you're aware today. Office buildings, beach resorts, and airports hijacked the international style, and the unpoliced towers in the park housing projects turned into the new city slums. By 1969, the major pioneering international style architects from Mies to Walter Gropius to Le Corbusier had died, leaving behind a new generation that would, for a time, be content to copy the masters. But as we saw, the many idealistic concepts of urbanism had disastrous results. Specifically, the idea of Le Corbusier's tower in the park concept, which came to define poorly defined public housing projects all around the world, which alienated people from cities and from living diverse lives. We realized an architect cannot fabricate a city. It must grow up organically to best serve people organically. But nevertheless, the skylines of cities around the world became homogenized into international style landscapes with the occasional historical relic. And so it seems we're again where the neoclassicists were at the start of this class, facing a world being taken over no longer by factories, but now by international style corporations, desperately longing for a new expressive architectural movement.